The title of today's piece is CBAM-alam, What's a Carbon Tax Got to Do with It? Before Justin Trudeau resigned as Liberal Party leader and Prime Minister, his government committed to mandating climate disclosures, maintaining carbon taxes, consumer and industrial, and introducing a carbon border adjustment mechanism, or CBAM. New Liberal Party leader Prime Minister Mark Carney has pledged to follow through with, if not accelerate, these commitments under the guise of diversifying trade to the European Union, or EU, and away from the United States. There are three key interrelated components to Mark Carney's climate plan that will transform and undermine Canadian businesses and the economy: compliance with the EU's CBAM, mandatory climate disclosures, and CO2 emissions taxes. Let's dive in.
On the one hand, we have our largest trading partner, as we've been discussing, attacking us, putting tariffs on us. On the other hand, we have the opportunity to diversify trade. Guess what one of the requirements is to diversify trade to the European Union? Guess what one of the requirements is to diversify trade to the United Kingdom? Guess what one of the requirements will be to diversify trade to emerging Asia? Is to have a form of price on carbon.
First of all, I'd like to clarify Carney's remarks at his press conference in London on 17 March 2025. The only jurisdiction that has implemented a CBAM is the EU. It is currently in a transitional phase with full implementation set for 2026 for 6 high-emitting industries: cement, iron and steel, aluminum, fertilizer, electricity, and hydrogen. There are various discussions about sectoral expansion by 2030, especially for agricultural products, but nothing conclusive has been decided as of yet. The UK is working towards implementing a CBAM for 1 January 2027, and that would cover the same 6 sectors as the EU. And despite Carney's comments about needing a carbon tax for trading with emerging Asian markets, no Asian country has released any timeline or trajectory for establishing a CBAM. The argument made by Carney is that in order to trade with the EU, exporters will need to have paid a domestic carbon tax, or the EU will charge more for those imports. But it's more than that. Exporting companies will also have to monitor, account for, and verify their CO2 emissions in order to trade with the EU. During the transition period, importers are permitted to estimate the emissions from foreign countries. However, beginning in 2026, only a maximum of 20% of emissions may be estimated. The rest must be monitored, collected, and verified by the exporter, and that information must be provided to the importer, who also must verify the information starting in 2026. So, what is the purpose of a CBAM? The goal, supposedly, is to reduce so-called carbon leakage, which means making imports from emissions-intensive sectors more costly so that production remains in the EU or foreign countries change their practices to be less emissions-intensive. How does it work? A CBAM is designed to impose a CO2 emissions tariff or cost on imported goods that is equivalent to what would be paid by companies if the commodities, goods, or products were produced under the EU's carbon pricing rules or emissions trading system. That sounds simple enough, but in practice, the EU's CBAM represents a significant expansion of government involvement in business operations and creates a whole new layer of bureaucracy. Technically, an exporting jurisdiction does not need to have a carbon tax or emissions trading system because that will be charged by the EU. But the EU system does require corporate emissions accounting, which is the key element of climate disclosures being advanced by the International Sustainability Standards Board, its mini-me, the Canadian Sustainability Standards Board, and the European Financial Reporting Advisory Group. The CBAM isn't just a tariff. It's a vehicle for continuous emissions monitoring and verification, with many strings attached. A normal tariff is a set charge levied on the value of a commodity or product, whereas a CBAM requires many steps of reporting, inspection, verification, and approvals that increases costs with little discernible benefit. In fact, a recent OECD study suggests, in a best case scenario, that the CBAM might reduce global emissions by, wait for it, 0.54%. To be clear, a CBAM does not recognize or reward real environmental regulation or oversight, like land use, water, or air regulations. They don't matter. The only concern is embedded emissions and whether or not a country is levying some kind of CO2 emissions tax. And even that seems to be of secondary importance to the monitoring and accounting of corporate emissions. But how does the importer know what the embedded emissions are for the commodities and products being imported? The companies exporting to the EU must track or monitor and calculate the emissions embedded in their products. That data must then be verified by an EU accredited verifier paid for by the exporter. That information is then given to the importer, who then must submit a CBAM declaration. That declaration must be reviewed and calculations made before a certificate is issued to the importer and the appropriate taxes paid. What does this mean exactly? An EU briefing presentation explained that a company will have to account for Scope 1, Scope 2, and certain upstream Scope 3 emissions. Although downstream Scope 3 emissions are not included in the current phase of the CBAM, it is unclear if they will be taken into account in the next phase of the CBAM. What are these different emission categories? According to consultancy firm McKinsey summarizing the greenhouse gas protocol, Scope 1 emissions are greenhouse gases that an organization emits from sources it owns or controls directly. Scope 2 emissions are from the electricity or energy sourced outside the direct control of a company. They are indirect, deriving from an organization's purchase of electricity, steam, heat, or cooling. Scope 3 emissions are the comprehensive indirect emissions of a company, also known as its life cycle emissions, and those are that arise across the value chain, both upstream and downstream. So, in the Substack article, I have lots of diagrams, and there's one diagram that talks about the greenhouse gas protocol. And if you look at that diagram, you'll notice that both upstream and downstream Scope 3 emissions are included, and they can account for 80 to 90% of an organization's emissions if what they produce is widely used. Now, apparently, it's not good enough for an EU trading partner like Canada to say, we have a carbon tax in place on our industrial high emitters. The EU wants to know the details of precisely how much each company is paying. But even then, that's not enough. The EU wants to know the exact amount of emissions from each company and what the carbon tax is on that company based on their emissions, which is verified by a third party, of course, so that the EU can decide if an additional fee or tariff needs to be charged, and if so, how much it should be. So, to sum up, the EU's CBAM is the first of its kind attempt to force emissions accounting on trading partners, ostensibly to calculate the precise difference in carbon taxation between jurisdictions to be levied, all under the guise of preventing carbon leakage. The cost of emissions accounting and verification is quite significant for companies, even large ones like Nutrien, a major Canadian fertilizer corporation. For example, I asked Grok how much it would cost for a company like Nutrien to do its emissions accounting and verification. And the sums given were between $650,000 and $2 million, depending on how much they had to outsource, how much they did in house, and whether they had to pay for outside consulting fees and then for the third party verification. So, for Canada to continue or increase its exports to the EU, as Liberal Party leader Mark Carney would like, this will impose an intricate web of emissions monitoring, verification, and compliance that burdens Canadian businesses with significant expenses and bureaucratic overhead, all without rewarding real regulatory efforts. Canada, pivoting towards this EU alignment, will transform Canada's economy, with a questionable return on investment for both businesses and the planet. If Canada wants to diversify its trade away from the United States, it should be looking towards India or Asia, where economies are actually growing, and not the EU, where its economy is shrinking from this type of burdensome climate related policies.